As Brian Tracy said, successful people are simply those with successful habits. And one of the best habits that I've ever acquired in my life is the habit of daily reading of nonfiction books. An hour a day, every day, no matter what. And over the past year, I've really made considerable gains with my reading. And it's what I want to talk about in this video, which is focusing in on biographies and autobiographies. Reading these has had such a crazy impact. So in this video, I'm basically going to sell you guys on the idea of why you should be reading biographies in the first place. We're going to run through 4 of the key benefits that I've gotten from reading biographies. And then I'll finish it off with 8 of the best biographies that I've read in the past year that you may not have heard of. So for the past 3,000 plus years, 97% of the most hyper successful people that have ever lived, and you can define success in any way you want, but not just monetary. These are people that have really just changed humanity for all time, who have freed millions of people, who have overcome massive adversity and really had a great impact. 97% of them have either they themselves sat down for a year and a half and just tediously typed out their life story, or they've had people that have come lifetimes after them interview hundreds of people, read thousands of manuscripts, work with editors for 3 to 5 years, all to compile this book, this work of art that you can then consume for $8 from the bookstore. And almost no one is reading in general, but almost no one is reading these biographies. So we have the most successful people ever that have written down their life stories that kind of show how they got to that point, and we can consume that. The biggest benefit by far that I've gotten from reading biographies and autobiographies is the magic of thinking bigger. So one thing you'll notice is people that have accomplished big things obviously have thought big. And what I've really realized is that everyone thinks big. I have big thoughts, you have big thoughts. And I think the main difference between unsuccessful people or moderately successful people and hyper successful people is that they had big idealist thoughts, but instead of immediately shooting them down because they were the ones that came up with it, they said, okay, I'm going to do that. I can do it. And they went out and they did it. And they had their entire family and friends and everyone was doubting them and almost actively stopping them to do it. But they just went out and continuously failed until they succeeded. Like they say, we're the conglomeration of the 5 people that we hang out with the most. And I don't think there's really any difference between reading someone's book and spending an hour with them. So if you sit down with Benjamin Franklin's autobiography and read it for 60 minutes, you're essentially picking up on his mindsets, his belief systems, his attitudes. You're seeing his success patterns and you're learning to adopt those into your own life. So even if you can't hang out with a billionaire on a day-to-day basis, you can read their books and pretty much get the same thing. So it'll help you start thinking way bigger in your own life. For example, Nelson Mandela has an incredible autobiography. He spent 30 years in jail. He was wrongfully imprisoned for political activism, trying to get the same rights for blacks as those as whites in South Africa. And he was in jail for 30 years. He almost died. And then while he was in jail, he was able to stay sane. He wrote a good portion of his autobiography, and he led political activism while he was in jail. And then he left 30 years later and became the first president of South Africa. So when you read his book and then you think about your own life, you're like, okay, well, maybe I can accomplish these little tasks that I have. And you just start to think bigger. The second main benefit is that by reading multiple biographies, you start to point out different success patterns that occur across almost every successful person. These are things such as waking up early. Thomas Jefferson said that the sun hasn't caught him in his bed for 50 years. Reading voraciously. Warren Buffett reads 500 pages a day. He reads 8 hours a day, constantly learning and taking in new material. Most successful people have traveled excessively. There's just certain patterns that you're going to see over and over again. And like I said, we're always relating this information back to our own lives. So we start picking up on those habits and start enacting them ourselves. So the third main benefit is by reading biographies, it really helps us adopt a longer time perspective. So the book you're reading might be about an 80-year-old, and what you'll see often with biographies is that people didn't become successful until they were 30, 40, 60 years old is when they finally became recognized. And when you're reading their book, you're seeing everything that went into their life when they were 20 and 30 and before all that kind of stuff happened. And you kind of notice the law of incremental improvement, that most of these successful people, the reason why they got to where they are today, where they're famous or this or that, is that every day they just did monotonous, boring tasks and got 1% better every single day, so that 30 years down the road, they're leaps and bounds beyond everyone else and they're able to accomplish way more than normal people. And this really just came from that law of incremental improvement. So how this relates back to your own life is you start thinking with a longer term perspective. So for me, like, I used to kind of think in terms of the next week, month, year. And from reading biographies, I've really started to look like 10 years down the road and think about, okay, where do I want to be in 10 years? And what kind of skills am I going to have to develop every day, like for the next 10 years to get to that point? So I think it helps us kind of relax us with our goals to a certain extent. Like, we get bigger goals from reading biographies, but then you get a longer time perspective and you see that life is short, but at the same time, life lasts a long time. The last major benefit from reading biographies is really the historical perspective that it provides us with. I don't think there's any better way to learn about a country or a culture or a time in history than to read someone's biography, mainly because it's just a dynamic story. And as you read these books throughout their lives, you'll notice different current events that are going on, politics, just everything that happens. It gives you a broader perspective of history. So for example, I read Joseph Stalin's biography, and he's not necessarily an inspiring guy, but I learned a ton from him about Russian history, about communism, the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution, World War II, maniacal dictators. And what was really interesting is that these books often coincide with each other. So a couple months later, I read the biography of Armand Hammer, which is really cool, and you guys can check it out below. But he, for a long time, was the only American that had business relations with the Soviet Union. And so he had close relations with Lenin and all the Soviet leaders, and for the longest time, he was an intermediary between American presidents and Soviet Union leaders. And so those just compounded upon each other and just paint a much richer story of history that's way more interesting than what you'll learn in any history class. So I hope you guys liked these points that I made. You can check out the link below. I wrote a more detailed article on my blog, and at the end of it, I have the 8 of the best books that I've read in the past year that you guys might not have read. Comment below as well with any biographies that you guys have read recently that you really like. And my call to action today is basically think of the most inspiring historical figure you can. This might be someone that you admire, that you maybe have seen a documentary on them, or you're just curious about, and go out and get a book about them and read it every day, an hour a day, until you're done with it. And when you're finished, just observe your thoughts and see if you start thinking a little bit bigger, if you start kind of planning out 10 years ahead instead of just the next day, and report back with the results. In the meantime, have fun reading.